On the morning of October 14th, 1851, in the cramped parlor of a farmhouse outside Bowling Green, Kentucky, 3 brothers stood around a table while a lawyer read their father's will. The autumn rain tapped against the window glass like impatient fingers. The room smelled of tobacco and damp wool and the faint sweetness of decay that clings to a house where someone has recently died. The eldest brother, Harold Sutner, received the farm, 320 acres of good bottomland along the barren river, with the house, the barn, and the livestock. The middle brother, George, received the family's general store in town, along with its inventory and debts owed by customers. Both men nodded with the satisfied gravity of men receiving what they believed they deserved. The youngest brother, Eli Sutner, received a parcel of rocky hillside land 7 miles south of town, 40 acres of limestone bluffs, cedar thickets, and a cave entrance that their father had used on occasion to store smoked meat during the hottest weeks of summer. That was all. No money, no tools, no livestock, just rocks and darkness and trees too gnarled to harvest for lumber. Harold leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Well, Eli, Father always did say you had your head in the clouds. I suppose he figured you'd feel right at home in a hole in the ground." George's wife, Ada, who had positioned herself near the doorway as though her presence at the reading were accidental, covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. George himself said nothing, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward. The lawyer, a thin man named Pendleton who had known the Sutner family for 30 years, cleared his throat. "There is an additional note," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Your father wrote it himself, in his own hand, as a codicil. It reads, 'To Eli, I leave the hill land and the cave because he is the only one of my sons who ever looked at something without immediately asking what it was worth. I trust he will find value where others see none.'" The room was quiet. Harold's smile faded. Ada's hand dropped from her mouth. George stared at the table. Eli looked at the document. He looked at the lawyer, who offered a small, careful nod. He looked at the rain on the window. Then he folded the paper, placed it inside his coat, and stood. "Thank you," he said. He said it to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone, or perhaps to the house itself, which he understood he would never enter again as anything other than a guest. He was 31 years old. He had spent the last 6 years teaching himself to read Latin from a priest's abandoned library, had apprenticed for 2 summers with a stonemason in Louisville, and had kept a journal of observations about the birds, insects, and geological formations of Warren County that ran to over 400 pages. None of his brothers knew about the journal. None of them had ever asked what Eli did with his time. He walked out into the rain. He did not look back. The cave mouth opened in the side of a limestone bluff like a wound in the earth's skin, roughly 8 feet wide and 5 feet tall, curtained with Virginia creeper that had gone scarlet with the season. Eli arrived at his inheritance on October 17th, carrying everything he owned on his back and in a hand cart he'd built himself 3 years earlier: a bedroll, a canvas tarp, an axe, a hand saw, a hammer, a set of chisels, 3 books, his journal, a lantern, a cookpot, and $17 in coin. He stood before the cave and felt the air moving outward from the darkness, warm, steady, damp, like the breath of some vast sleeping animal. He had noticed this before, years ago, when he'd accompanied his father here to hang venison. The air inside the cave had been warm in October, cool in July. His father had dismissed it as just the way caves are, and thought no more of it. Eli had thought a great deal more of it. He had read, in a geology text borrowed from the lending library in Bowling Green, that caves maintained a nearly constant temperature year-round, a temperature roughly equal to the average annual temperature of the region above them. In central Kentucky, that meant somewhere near 55 degrees. 55 degrees was not warm. But it was not freezing either. It was a foundation. A man who started at 55 degrees in the dead of winter needed to generate far less heat to reach comfort than a man who started at 0. Eli ducked through the entrance and lit his lantern. The cave opened into a chamber roughly 30 feet wide and 12 feet high, with a sandy floor and walls of pale gray limestone streaked with darker bands of chert. The air was still and heavy with mineral dampness. Water seeped along one wall in a thin, steady film that collected in a natural basin near the back, a reliable water source, Eli noted, that would not freeze in winter. The ceiling was sound, with no visible fractures or loose formations. The walls were dry, except for the seepage area. He set down his lantern and listened. Silence, except for the faint drip of water, and, if he held very still, the whisper of air moving through some unseen passage deeper in the rock. He had expected to feel despair. He did not. What he felt, standing in that ancient chamber with the lantern light climbing the walls, was something closer to recognition, as though the cave had been waiting and he had finally arrived. "All right," he said aloud, and his voice came back to him softly from the stone. "Let's see what you are." That first night, Eli lay in his bedroll on the sandy floor of the cave and stared at the ceiling, where the lantern cast shadows that moved like slow water. The stone above him was 300 million years old. Mississippian-era limestone, laid down when this part of Kentucky was the floor of a shallow tropical sea. He thought about the creatures whose shells and skeletons had become this rock, the incomprehensible weight of time that had compressed life into stone. He thought about his father's codicil and wondered whether the old man had understood more than anyone had given him credit for. He thought about Harold and George, who were at that moment sleeping in proper beds in heated rooms. And he thought about the 54-degree air that surrounded him like a second skin, and he decided that he was not cold, he was not afraid, and he would not leave. He slept. The cave held him. The first month was the hardest. Eli worked from dawn until he could no longer see by lantern light, and sometimes beyond that, shaping the cave mouth into something more habitable. He built a dry, stacked limestone wall across the lower half of the entrance, leaving a doorway fitted with a frame of hewn cedar planks and a door he constructed from split oak boards. Above the wall, he left a gap of 18 inches for ventilation, which he could close with a hinged wooden shutter when the wind drove rain or snow horizontally across the bluff face. Inside, he leveled the sandy floor and laid flat stones to create a solid surface. He built a sleeping platform against the warmest wall, the one farthest from the entrance and nearest to the deeper passages, raising it 18 inches off the ground on stacked limestone to keep himself above the cold air that pooled along the floor. He stuffed a canvas sack with dried cedar boughs for a mattress. He built a simple hearth near the entrance where the natural draft would carry smoke outward, though he quickly discovered he needed far less fire than he'd expected. The thermal mass of the surrounding limestone, thousands of tons of rock at a steady 54 degrees, absorbed and radiated heat with extraordinary efficiency. A small fire burned for an hour in the evening, raised the temperature of the main chamber to nearly 65 degrees, and the stone held that warmth for hours after the flames died. He recorded all of this in his journal. He recorded the outside temperature and the inside temperature each morning and evening, using a mercury thermometer he had purchased in Louisville the previous year. He recorded wind direction, precipitation, and the behavior of the air currents at the cave mouth. He was not merely surviving. He was studying. November came with iron skies and the first hard frost. Eli had laid in a supply of firewood, stacked in a natural alcove just inside the entrance where it stayed dry. He had smoked venison from a deer he'd shot on his own land, and he had dried apples and beans purchased with the last of his $17 from a farm wife named Mrs. Caulfield, who lived 2 miles down the valley. She had looked at him with open pity as she measured out the beans and had added a small sack of cornmeal without charging him. "You'll need it up there," she said. "Winter's coming hard this year. The woolly worms are all black." He was lean, but not hungry. He was cold sometimes in the mornings before he lit his fire, but never dangerously so. The cave held steady at 53 degrees, even when the outside air dropped to 12. The people of Bowling Green learned quickly about Eli Sutner's living situation, and their opinions arrived at the cave almost as reliably as the weather. A mail carrier named Dobbs, who passed along the ridge road above the bluff, stopped one afternoon in late November and called down to where Eli was splitting wood. "Sutner, your brother Harold says you're living in that cave like a bear. Says you've lost your mind." Eli set another log on the splitting stump. "I haven't lost anything. He says you ought to come work his farm. Says he'd give you a fair wage." "I have my own land." Dobbs laughed. "Land? That ain't land, Sutner. That's a rock pile with a hole in it." Eli split the log with a single clean stroke. "Depends on what you're looking for." Dobbs rode on, shaking his head. The story spread. By Christmas, Eli Sutner was the cautionary tale that mothers in Bowling Green told their children. The man who lived in a cave because he was too proud or too strange to accept help. The youngest son who had been dealt a poor hand and chosen to play it rather than fold. A grocer in town began referring to any bad deal as a Sutner inheritance. The phrase stuck. It made its way back to Eli through Mrs. Caulfield, who reported it with an embarrassed shake of her head. None of them came to see the cave. None of them asked what he was building. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. The first winter taught Eli more than any book he had ever read. He learned that the cave breathed, inhaling cold air along the floor of the entrance in the evening and exhaling warmer air from the ceiling during the day, a natural convection cycle driven by the temperature differential between the cave interior and the outside air. He learned to work with this breathing rather than against it, positioning his fire and his sleeping platform and his ventilation openings to take advantage of the airflow patterns. By January, he could maintain the main chamber at a steady 60 degrees with nothing more than a small fire burned twice a day and the body heat of his own living presence. He learned the water. The seepage along the back wall was consistent and clean, filtered through hundreds of feet of limestone. He carved a channel in the stone to direct it into a deeper basin he had chiseled out, creating a reservoir that held roughly 10 gallons. The water was cold and tasted faintly of minerals, calcium and magnesium, he suspected, leached from the surrounding rock. He drank it every day and never fell ill. He learned the stone. Limestone, he discovered, was remarkably workable when freshly exposed to air, what quarrymen called green stone, still saturated with groundwater. He could shape it with a chisel almost as easily as hard wood. As it dried, it hardened considerably, becoming a durable building material. He used this property to carve shelves, ledges, and niches directly into the cave walls, creating storage and living spaces that were literally part of the rock. He learned the silence. That was perhaps the most important lesson. The silence of a cave is not the silence of an empty room. It is a living silence, a silence that contains the drip of water, the slow exhalation of air, the faint crackling of stone adjusting to changes in temperature and humidity that no human sense can detect. Eli learned to sit in that silence and listen, the way a hunter learns to sit in a forest and wait. The cave spoke to him in a language of sounds so subtle that they were more felt than heard, and over the weeks and months he began to understand what they meant. A change in the pitch of the dripping water meant rain on the surface above. A shift in the air current meant a change in atmospheric pressure, a storm approaching or clearing. The cave was not separate from the world. It was connected to everything, a stone ear pressed to the body of the earth. In February, during the coldest week of the winter, when the outside temperature dropped to 4 degrees below zero and the snow lay 2 feet deep on the hillside, a farmer named Jessup lost his way in a blizzard while driving his wagon home from town. He stumbled to the cave entrance half frozen, his mule dead in the traces a quarter-mile back. Eli brought him inside, wrapped him in blankets, fed him hot broth, and laid him on the sleeping platform near the warm wall. By morning, Jessup's color had returned, and his fingers, which he had believed lost to frostbite, were merely stiff and sore. "What temperature is it in here?" Jessup asked, looking around the cave with the bewildered eyes of a man who had expected to die and instead woke up comfortable. 62 degrees, Eli said. "Same as yesterday, same as it'll be tomorrow." Jessup shook his head slowly. "It was 4 below last night. My horse froze standing up." "The stone holds the heat," Eli said. "It doesn't care what the weather does." Jessup told the story in town. It changed nothing. People still called the cave a hole in the ground. But Jessup himself never spoke ill of Eli Sutner again, and when people used the phrase, "a Sutner inheritance," Jessup was known to say quietly, "That cave saved my life, and it was warmer than any house in the county." And he began to explore. The passage at the back of the main chamber narrowed to a crawlway, roughly 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, angled slightly downward. Eli had glanced into it during his first week, but had not ventured far. Survival had demanded all his attention. Now, in the deep stillness of January, with his supplies adequate and his shelter sound, curiosity pulled him forward like a rope tied to his ribs. He lit a second lantern, tucked it into his belt, and crawled. The passage extended roughly 60 feet before opening into a second chamber, smaller than the first but higher ceilinged, perhaps 15 feet at its peak. The walls here were wetter, and the limestone had been carved by water into flowing organic shapes, curtains and columns, and shallow pools lined with a crust of crystalline calcite that glittered in the lantern light like scattered coins. Eli sat in the center of this chamber and simply looked. The beauty of it was so unexpected and so complete that he did not write in his journal for several minutes. He simply breathed and watched the light move on the stone. Then he noticed something else. Along the far wall, partially obscured by a fallen column of limestone, there were marks in the stone. Not natural marks. Not the random scoring of water or the teeth of some burrowing animal. These were regular parallel grooves cut into the floor of the cave, roughly 4 inches apart, running from the second chamber into another passage that continued deeper into the hillside. Eli knelt beside them and ran his fingers along the grooves. They were smooth, worn, and consistent in depth. They were not ancient. The stone around them showed tool marks, the distinctive pattern of a flat chisel struck with a mallet. Someone had cut these grooves deliberately and with considerable effort. They looked, Eli realized with a start, that raised the hair on his forearms, exactly like the rails of a small-gauge tramway. He did not sleep well that night. He lay on his cedar bough mattress and listened to the cave breathe and thought about those grooves. A tramway meant transport. Transport meant something worth moving. Something worth moving, deep inside a hill that his father had used for nothing more than storing smoked meat, meant a secret. In the morning, he returned with both lanterns, a length of rope, and his journal. He followed the grooves. The passage beyond the second chamber was tighter than the crawlway, barely 2 feet wide in places, though the ceiling was high enough that he could walk upright if he turned sideways. The rails continued along the floor, and now he could see that the walls bore chisel marks as well. This passage had been widened by hand. Someone had spent weeks, perhaps months, cutting through solid limestone to extend this corridor. After roughly 100 feet, the passage opened suddenly and dramatically into a space that made Eli stop and hold his lantern high and say, in a voice that came out as barely more than a whisper, "Good Lord." The chamber was enormous. The lantern light could not reach the far wall. Eli estimated later that it was at least 80 feet wide and 60 feet deep, with a ceiling that arched 25 feet overhead. But it was not the size that stopped his breath. It was what the chamber contained. Along both walls, stacked on shelves that had been carved directly into the limestone, were barrels. Dozens of barrels. Eli counted 47 before he stopped counting, made of white oak, bound with iron hoops, each roughly the size of a standard whiskey barrel. They were arranged with care, tilted slightly forward on their shelves, and many of them had small wooden spigots fitted into their front heads. The smell hit him then. It had been there since he entered, but his mind had been so occupied with the visual spectacle that his nose had lagged behind. It was rich, complex, unmistakable. The deep vanilla and caramel scent of aging bourbon whiskey, so concentrated in this enclosed space that it was almost intoxicating just to breathe. Eli approached the nearest barrel and touched it. The oak was cool and slightly damp. He examined the spigot, turned it carefully, and caught a thin stream of amber liquid in his cupped palm. He tasted it. He was not a drinking man by habit, but he had tasted whiskey before. The rough corn liquor that was as common as water in rural Kentucky, and occasionally a glass of something finer at a tavern in Louisville. What touched his tongue now was neither of those things. It was smooth, impossibly complex, with layers of flavor that seemed to unfold one after another. Honey, then oak, then something like dried fruit, then a warmth that spread through his chest like a slow sunrise. It was, without question, the finest whiskey he had ever encountered. He stood in that vast underground chamber, surrounded by a fortune in aged bourbon, and tried to understand what he had found. The rails made sense now. Someone had rolled these barrels along the tramway from the entrance, or perhaps from another entrance he had not yet discovered, and stored them here, deep in the hillside, where the temperature held steady at 54 degrees, and the humidity was constant, and the darkness was absolute. These were, Eli realized, perfect aging conditions, better than any warehouse or rickhouse on the surface, where barrels endured the brutal swings of Kentucky seasons, expanding and contracting, gaining and losing whiskey to evaporation, the portion that distillers called the angel's share. Down here, there would be almost no angel's share. The constant temperature and humidity would slow the aging process, but also refine it, producing a whiskey of extraordinary smoothness and complexity. How long had these barrels been here? Eli examined the nearest shelf and found a date carved into the limestone beside it, 1829. 22 years. These barrels had been aging in silence and darkness for 22 years. Eli spent the next 3 days exploring the full extent of the cave system and piecing together the story that the stone and wood and iron told him. He found a second entrance, a narrow, vertical shaft concealed by a thicket of cedar trees on the far side of the hill, fitted with a wooden ladder that had rotted and collapsed. At the base of the shaft, a short passage connected to the barrel chamber. This, he realized, was how the barrels had been brought in, lowered down the shaft on ropes and rolled along the tramway to their resting places. He found more carvings in the stone, dates, initials, and in one place, a brief inscription that read JMS for future days. The initials matched no one Eli could immediately identify, but the style of the carving and the construction of the shelves and tramway suggested a single individual working alone over a period of years. Whoever JMS was, he had been methodical, patient, and deeply knowledgeable about both stonemasonry and whiskey production. Eli also found, in a small alcove near the second entrance, a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were papers, a journal, much like Eli's own, though older and written in a cramped, precise hand. The first entry was dated March 12, 1828. He carried the box back to his main chamber, lit his fire, and read. The journal belonged to one James Morgan Stokes, a distiller who had operated a small whiskey operation on the very land that now belonged to Eli. Stokes had purchased the property in 1824, well before Eli's father had acquired it in 1836, and had discovered the cave system while clearing cedar for his still house. Recognizing the potential of the constant underground temperature, Stokes had spent 4 years constructing the tramway and barrel shelves, and had begun aging his whiskey in the cave in 1828. The whiskey had been exceptional. Stokes wrote about it with the quiet pride of a craftsman who knows he has found something extraordinary. He described his experiments with different grain bills, varying the proportions of corn, rye, and malted barley to produce spirits of different character. He noted which positions on the cave shelves produced the best results, observing that barrels placed higher, where the air was slightly warmer and drier, aged differently from those near the floor. He sketched diagrams of the tramway and the shelving system, annotated with measurements and notes about weight-bearing capacity and drainage. He was, Eli realized, not merely a distiller, but an engineer and a scientist, a man who approached his craft with the same meticulous curiosity that Eli brought to his journal of natural observations. But Stokes had also been unlucky. A business partner had cheated him, selling their shared inventory of grain at a profit and leaving Stokes with the debts. A fire had destroyed his still house in the summer of 1830. And though Stokes rebuilt it, the cost consumed his remaining savings. His wife had died in childbirth in 1831, and his only child, a daughter named Margaret, had been sent to live with relatives in Virginia. Broken and in debt, Stokes had sold the land to Eli's father in 1836 and left Kentucky. The last entry in the journal was dated September 3rd, 1836. I leave the barrels where they are. They are better off in the dark and quiet than in the hands of men who would not understand them. Perhaps someday someone will find them who knows what they have found. Eli closed the journal and sat for a long time in the firelight. His father had never explored the cave beyond the first chamber. Neither had Harold or George. For 15 years, a fortune in whiskey had aged in perfect darkness, less than 200 feet from where the Sutner family hung their smoked hams, and none of them had ever thought to look deeper. He thought about James Morgan Stokes, a man he had never met, who had built something extraordinary and lost it to bad luck and bad partners and grief. He thought about the inscription in the stone, "For future days," and wondered if Stokes had imagined, even hoped, that someone like Eli might someday crawl through that passage and find what he had left behind. He thought about his father's codicil, "The only one of my sons who ever looked at something without immediately asking what it was worth," and he understood for the first time that his father had known him better than he had realized. Purpose was a stronger medicine than rest. Eli did not rush to sell the whiskey. This was perhaps the decision that most clearly revealed his character. A desperate man, or a greedy one, would have rolled barrels to market within the week. Eli instead spent the next 2 months studying. He read Stokes's journal cover to cover 3 times. He examined each barrel individually, noting its condition, its date, and the character of the whiskey it contained. He found that the barrels varied. Some held a lighter, more floral spirit, while others were deeper and richer. The oldest barrels, dating from 1829 and 1830, held whiskey of almost supernatural complexity, so smooth it barely burned and so flavorful that a single sip seemed to contain an entire landscape of taste. He also thought carefully about the legal and ethical dimensions of his discovery. The land was his, deeded to him by his father, who had purchased it from Stokes. The barrels were on his land, in his cave, and Stokes's journal made clear that they had been deliberately left behind. Eli was not stealing. He was inheriting, not from his father, who had never known what lay beneath his feet, but from a stranger who had trusted the future. In March of 1852, when the roads were passable again after the spring thaw, Eli loaded 2 barrels onto a cart he had built and hauled them to Bowling Green. He did not go to his brother's. He went to the office of a man named Dr. Charles Redfield, a physician who was also known as the most knowledgeable whiskey connoisseur in Warren County. Redfield had traveled in Scotland and had studied the aging processes of Scotch whiskey, and he maintained a private collection of fine spirits in his home that was said to be the best between Louisville and Nashville. Eli knocked on Redfield's door at 9 in the morning and explained, in his quiet, methodical way, that he had something he would like the doctor to taste. Redfield was skeptical. He knew Eli by reputation, the cave-dwelling youngest Sutner, the odd one, the Sutner inheritance man. But there was something in Eli's manner that was not the manner of a madman or a fool, and Redfield was, above all things, curious. He tasted the whiskey. He sat down. He tasted it again. He held the glass up to the window and studied the color, a deep, luminous amber that caught the light like a jewel. He inhaled the aroma. He tasted it a 3rd time. "Where?" he said, and his voice had changed entirely. "Did you get this?" Eli told him. Not everything. Not the tramway, not the journal, not the full extent of the discovery. But enough. Cave-aged whiskey. 22 years in constant darkness at 54 degrees. Redfield set down his glass and looked at Eli as though seeing him for the first time. "Mr. Sutner," he said, "I have tasted whiskey from every notable distillery in Kentucky and Scotland. I have tasted whiskey that cost more per barrel than most men earn in a year. What you have brought me is, without any exaggeration, the finest bourbon I have ever put to my lips." He paused. "How many barrels do you have?" "Enough," Eli said. Redfield became Eli's partner. Not in ownership, but in commerce. The doctor had connections throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, and he understood the market for fine spirits in a way that Eli, who had spent his adult life reading Latin and watching birds, did not. Together, they developed a plan. They would not flood the market. They would sell the cave-aged whiskey in small quantities at premium prices to a select clientele of connoisseurs, hotel owners, and wealthy collectors. Redfield would handle the sales and the social aspects. Eli would manage the whiskey itself, learning the craft of cooperage and aging that Stokes had pioneered. The first barrels sold in the spring of 1852 for $12 each, roughly 6 times the going rate for good Kentucky bourbon. By autumn, word had spread among those who dealt in fine spirits, and the price rose to $18. By the following year, barrels of Sutner Cave bourbon, as Redfield had christened it, were selling for $25 to buyers in Louisville, Cincinnati, and as far away as New York. Eli used the money carefully. He improved the cave, expanding his living quarters, installing a proper door and windows cut into the limestone face, building furniture from walnut and cherry that he felled on his own land. He purchased tools. He bought books, volumes on chemistry, geology, cooperage, and distillation. He built a small, still house on the hillside above the cave, using plans adapted from Stokes's journal and his own study of the science of fermentation and distillation. He began to make his own whiskey, not to replace the Stokes barrels. Those were irreplaceable, each one a time capsule of a dead man's art. But to continue the experiment, he sourced corn and rye from local farmers, built his mash tuns and fermentation vessels with the same care he brought to everything, and rolled his first barrels into the cave for aging in September of 1853. He carved the date into the limestone beside them, just as Stokes had done, and added his own initials, EAS. He also repaired the second entrance, replacing the rotted ladder with a sturdy one of his own construction, and built a simple crane mechanism for lowering barrels down the shaft. The tramway he cleared and maintained, oiling the rail grooves and replacing the small wooden cart that Stokes had used to move barrels through the passages. The people of Bowling Green noticed the changes. It was difficult not to. The strange, quiet man in the cave was suddenly purchasing supplies, hiring occasional labor for heavy construction work, and driving a cart to town that smelled powerfully of fine whiskey. The mockery did not stop entirely, but it shifted in character. Where before they had pitied him, now they were confused. Where before they had laughed at the cave dweller, now they whispered about him. What was he doing in there? Harold Sutner heard the whispers and came to see for himself. He arrived at the cave on a warm afternoon in June of 1853, riding his best horse, and found Eli sitting at a desk he had built beside the cave entrance, writing in his journal. "Eli," Harold said, dismounting with the heavy grace of a man who had grown comfortable and thick. "People are talking?" "People talk. They say you're selling whiskey. Good whiskey. They say Redfield's involved." Eli closed his journal. "That's correct." Harold looked at the cave entrance, the fitted stone wall, the proper door with its iron hinges, the glass window that admitted light into the front chamber. It looked nothing like the hole in the ground he had mocked 2 years earlier. It looked, despite its unusual location, like the entrance to a home. "Where did you get whiskey to sell?" "I found it." "Found it? Where?" Eli looked at his brother, at the broad, ruddy face that had laughed when the will was read, at the hands that had never held a chisel or a book, at the eyes that had never once looked at Eli and seen anything worth knowing. "Deeper," he said simply. "I looked deeper." Harold waited for more. None came. He remounted his horse and rode away, and Eli returned to his journal. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel vindication. He felt only the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found what he was looking for and knew there was still more to find. In the autumn of 1854, Eli traveled to Louisville to purchase copper fittings for an improved still he was designing. It was in a bookshop on Market Street, while examining a new translation of a German text on mineral chemistry, that he met Clara Wendt. Clara was 26 years old, the daughter of a German immigrant watchmaker who had settled in Louisville in 1840. She was small and dark-haired and had the direct, appraising gaze of someone who was accustomed to looking closely at small, intricate things. She was, at the moment Eli first saw her, arguing with the bookshop owner about the price of a volume on botanical illustration. Eli did not approach her. He was not a man who approached women in bookshops or anywhere else. But Clara noticed him examining the mineral chemistry text, and when she had finished her negotiation, she got the book for 2/3 of the asking price. She turned to him and said, without preamble, "Do you actually read German, or are you just admiring the diagrams?" "I read some," Eli said. "Enough to follow the chemistry. The technical vocabulary is easier than the literary." Clara studied him the way her father studied the interior of a watch, with interest and without judgment. "You're a scientist?" "I'm a man who lives in a cave and makes whiskey." She laughed. It was an unexpected sound, bright and unguarded, the laugh of someone who was genuinely surprised. "That," she said, "is the most interesting introduction I have ever received." They talked for 2 hours. Eli told her about the cave, the whiskey, the science of aging and temperature and limestone. Clara told him about her father's watchmaking, about the precision and patience required to fit gears no larger than a grain of rice, about her own education. She'd been schooled at home by her father, who believed that a woman's mind was as worthy of cultivation as a man's. She had read widely in science and literature, spoke 3 languages, and had published 2 botanical illustrations in a Cincinnati journal under a male pseudonym. When the bookshop closed, they continued walking and talking through the streets of Louisville until the gas lamps were lit and the autumn darkness settled over the city like a quilt. They stood on the bridge over the Ohio River and watched the last light die on the water, and Clara told him about a theory she had developed regarding the relationship between mineral content in soil and the color intensity of autumn leaves, a theory that Eli found both scientifically plausible and deeply beautiful in its implications. "You're saying the colors were always there," he said, "in the soil. The trees just translate them." "Exactly," Clara said. "The beauty isn't created in autumn. It's revealed. The leaves have been carrying those pigments all summer, masked by chlorophyll. When the green fades, you see what was always underneath." Eli looked at her in the lamplight and thought that this was the most remarkable conversation he had ever had with another human being. He returned to Bowling Green the next day. He wrote to Clara the following week. She wrote back. The letters continued through the winter. Long, detailed, curious letters that discussed everything from the crystalline structure of calcite to the poetry of John Keats. In February, Eli sent her a small bottle of the oldest Stokes whiskey. She wrote back that it was extraordinary and that she had analyzed its color through her father's jeweler's loupe and found it contained suspended particles of incredible uniformity, which she hypothesized were wood-tannin compounds of unusual molecular structure. Eli read that letter 3 times and felt something shift inside him, like a stone settling into its final position. He traveled to Louisville again in March of 1855 and asked Clara to visit the cave. She came the following week, accompanied by her father, a small, precise man named Heinrich Wendt, who wore spectacles and spoke English with a heavy accent and the careful grammar of someone who had learned the language from books. They arrived at the bluff on a cool spring morning when the redbuds were blooming pink along the hillsides and the dogwoods were opening their white crosses in the forest understory. Eli showed them the main chamber, now furnished with a proper bed, a desk, shelves of books, and a kitchen area with a stone sink and iron stove. He showed them the second chamber with its calcite formations. He showed them the tramway, the barrel shelves, the vast aging room with its cathedral ceiling and its scent of vanilla and oak. Clara walked through the chambers with her hands trailing along the walls, touching the stone the way a musician touches an instrument. Heinrich examined the tramway rails with professional admiration, noting the precision of the chisel work. Neither of them said anything about the strangeness of living underground. They saw what Eli saw. Not a cave, but a workshop, a laboratory, a home. "The thermal stability is remarkable," Clara said, standing in the aging chamber with her eyes closed, breathing deeply. "The humidity must be nearly constant. No wonder the whiskey ages so beautifully. It's like a womb." Heinrich nodded. "In the Black Forest, there are cellars cut into the mountain for aging wine. Same principle. The old people knew this. The earth keeps its own temperature." Eli looked at Clara in the lantern light, her face tilted upward, her eyes still closed, and he felt the certainty of a man who has found not just what he was looking for, but what he did not know he needed. He proposed to her in May, standing at the mouth of the cave on an evening when the whippoorwills were calling from the cedar thickets, and the last light was painting the western sky in shades of copper and rose. She said yes without hesitation, and then she said, "I have one condition. You must let me set up a proper laboratory in one of the chambers. I intend to study every mineral in this hill." They married in June of 1855 in a small ceremony in Louisville, attended by Clara's family and Dr. Redfield, and no one from the Sutner family. Eli had sent word to both brothers. Neither responded. Clara moved into the cave. The years that followed were the richest of Eli's life, in every sense. With Clara's intelligence and energy added to his own, the cave homestead transformed. Clara designed and oversaw the construction of a stone-fronted extension built into the bluff face, adding 2 rooms with proper windows that admitted daylight while maintaining the thermal advantages of the cave. She planted a garden on the sunny slope above the entrance. Herbs, vegetables, and flowers that attracted the butterflies and birds that Eli still faithfully recorded in his journal. Together, they expanded the whiskey operation. Eli's own barrels, the ones he had laid down in 1853, were still aging. They would not be ready for years yet, he believed, based on his study of the Stokes whiskey and his own evolving understanding of the chemistry of maturation. But the remaining Stokes barrels continued to command extraordinary prices, and the income allowed them to invest in better equipment, more grain, and the gradual improvement of their home. Clara contributed something else, a systematic approach to record-keeping that went beyond Eli's journal observations. She created detailed logs of every barrel, its origin, its mash composition, the date it entered the cave, its position on the shelves, the temperature and humidity readings at its location. She devised a method for sampling small quantities without disturbing the barrels, using a thin glass tube that her father crafted to her specifications. She was, in effect, creating the first scientific database of cave-aged whiskey, and the patterns she identified in the data would guide Eli's production decisions for decades. Their first child, a son named James, after James Morgan Stokes, was born in 1857. A daughter, Helen, followed in 1859. A second son, Thomas, in 1862. The children grew up in the cave. They learned to read by lantern light and by the daylight that streamed through the windows Clara had designed. They played in the chambers and passages, knew the tramway rails as intimately as other children knew garden paths, and could navigate the darkness by touch and sound and the smell of different minerals in different sections of the stone. James, the eldest, was curious and verbal, always asking questions, always wanting to know why the calcite grew in curtains rather than columns, why some barrels smelled of vanilla and others of dried cherries. Helen was quieter, like her father, but with her mother's sharp eye. She began drawing the cave's mosses and ferns at the age of 7, producing sketches of startling accuracy. Thomas was the physical one, the climber and builder, who at age 5 could shinny up the ladder to the second entrance faster than his father could follow. They were, by any conventional measure, an unusual family, but they were a happy one. On winter evenings, Eli would read aloud from his books: geology, natural history, sometimes poetry, while Clara worked on her barrel logs and the children sat on the stone floor with their drawings and their specimens. The fire crackled in the hearth. The cave breathed its slow, warm breath, and the lantern light made the limestone walls glow like honey. It was, Eli sometimes thought, the most beautiful room in the world, because it had been built by hand and by love, and by the patient work of paying attention. The Civil War came and went. Kentucky's position as a border state made the years between 1861 and 1865 dangerous and uncertain. Eli, who was too old for conscription and too remote for easy requisition, kept his family safe in the cave, which was, he reflected with grim humor, perhaps the most defensible home in Warren County. Foraging soldiers from both armies occasionally passed through the valley, but the cave's entrance was invisible from the ridge road above, and Eli had constructed a concealed door that blended with the natural rock face. They were not disturbed. Once, in the spring of 1863, a Confederate patrol descended into the valley and camped for 2 days less than a quarter-mile from the cave entrance. Eli kept the children quiet, let the fire die, and waited. Clara, who had packed emergency supplies in the deepest chamber weeks earlier, fed the family cold cornbread and dried venison, and told the children stories in a whisper. The soldiers left without discovering them. Thomas, who was barely a year old, slept through the entire episode, warm in his blankets at 55 degrees, while armed men shivered around their campfire outside. After the war, the whiskey market expanded dramatically. Eli's reputation grew. Visitors began to arrive at the cave, not townspeople, but distillers, chemists, and connoisseurs from across the country, drawn by the legend of Sutner Cave bourbon. Eli received them all with the same quiet courtesy, showed them the aging chambers, explained the science of constant temperature maturation, and offered them a taste of whatever barrel he judged most instructive. In 1871, a professor of chemistry from the University of Virginia, named Dr. Alistair Crane, arrived to study the cave system. He spent 3 weeks measuring temperatures, analyzing water chemistry, and examining the microbiology of the barrel surfaces. His findings, published in a scientific journal the following year, confirmed what Eli had long observed. The cave environment produced a unique aging process in which the whiskey interacted with the oak at a slow, steady rate, never subjected to the violent thermal cycling of above-ground warehouses. The result was a spirit of unusual smoothness and complexity, with a chemical profile that Crane described as more akin to a 40-year Scotch than a 20-year bourbon. The paper brought more attention, more visitors, and more orders than Eli could fill. He did not try to fill them all. He aged his whiskey at the pace the cave demanded, slowly, patiently, without rushing, and sold only what he judged to be ready. Some barrels he never sold at all, holding them for years beyond what the market would have considered optimal, because he believed they had not yet reached their full expression. "The whiskey knows when it's finished," he told Clara. "I just have to listen." Harold Sutner died in 1873 at the age of 58, of a heart ailment aggravated by years of heavy eating and hard drinking, the ordinary corn whiskey that he consumed nightly, a cruel irony that did not escape those who knew both brothers. The farm he had inherited had suffered during the war, and his sons, neither of whom shared their father's modest talent for agriculture, had let it deteriorate further. By the time Harold died, the 320 acres of good bottomland were mortgaged to the hilt, and his widow was forced to sell. George's story was little better. The general store had failed in 1867, done in by competition from larger establishments in Bowling Green, and by George's indifferent management. Ada, whose social ambitions had driven much of George's business strategy, left him for a dry goods merchant in Nashville. George drifted south to Tennessee and was not heard from again. Eli learned of Harold's death from a letter. He attended the funeral, standing at the back of the small cemetery in his best coat, a well-made garment of dark wool, clean and pressed, the coat of a man who could afford quality but did not feel the need to display it. He did not speak to Harold's widow or sons. He laid a hand briefly on the coffin, closed his eyes for a moment, and left. He did not gloat. He did not compare his fortunes to his brothers. When Clara asked him how he felt, he sat for a long time before answering. "I feel," he said, "like a man who got lost in the woods and found a river while his brothers stayed on the road and walked into a swamp. I wasn't smarter than them. I just went a different direction." Clara put her hand on his. "You looked deeper." He smiled at that. "I looked deeper." The 1870s and 1880s were the decades of Eli's fullest flourishing. The cave homestead expanded into a complex of underground and surface structures that blended seamlessly with the hillside, a workshop, a cooperage where Eli built his own barrels from hand-selected white oak, a small schoolroom where Clara taught the children, and, eventually, a handful of neighboring families' children as well. The aging chambers held over 100 barrels at any given time, ranging from new-make spirit to whiskey that had slumbered in the darkness for 30 years or more. Eli taught his children everything he knew, not just the whiskey craft, but the science behind it, the geology of the cave, the ecology of the hillside, the discipline of observation and record-keeping that had been the foundation of everything he had built. James, the eldest, showed a gift for the business side and eventually traveled to Louisville and Cincinnati to manage sales. Helen, who had inherited her mother's sharp eye and her father's patience, became an accomplished botanical illustrator and published a book of the cave flora, the mosses, ferns, and fungi that thrived in the twilight zone near the entrance, that was praised by naturalists as both scientifically accurate and artistically beautiful. Thomas, the youngest, was the builder. He expanded the cave system itself, cutting new passages and chambers with a skill that would have impressed James Morgan Stokes. Eli also found Stokes's daughter. Through years of patient correspondence, letters to courthouses, churches, and postmasters across Virginia, he had traced Margaret Stokes, now Margaret Stokes Hartwell, married to a schoolteacher and living in Richmond. He sent her a letter describing what he had found. He included a small bottle of her father's whiskey, drawn from the oldest barrel, the one dated 1829. He told her about the journal, the tramway, the inscription, "For future days." He told her that her father had been a man of extraordinary skill and vision, and that the work he had done in that cave had outlasted his troubles and his grief, and would outlast them all. Her reply came 3 weeks later. She thanked him. She said she had been 6 years old when her father left Kentucky, and she remembered almost nothing of the cave or the whiskey, but she remembered his hands, large, rough, always smelling of oak and limestone. And she remembered that he had told her, the night before he sent her to Virginia, that he was leaving something behind that would be found when the time was right. "I believe," she wrote, "that you were the right person to find it. My father would have been pleased." Eli framed the letter and hung it in the aging chamber, beside the inscription in the stone. By the late 1880s, Eli Sutner was recognized as one of the most knowledgeable figures in American whiskey production. He never sought this recognition. It came to him the way water finds its level, naturally, inevitably, because there was nowhere else for it to go. Distillers visited the cave to study his methods. Scientists came to measure and analyze. Writers from Eastern newspapers descended on the Kentucky hills to profile the cave hermit distiller, as they called him. Though Eli was neither a hermit nor, he insisted, a distiller in any conventional sense. He was a man who had been given a cave and had looked inside it. One journalist from a New York paper, a young man named Redfield, who arrived expecting to find a picturesque eccentric, spent 3 days at the cave and left visibly changed. He had come prepared to write a colorful feature about a backwoods oddity, the kind of story that Eastern readers consumed with a comfortable mixture of amusement and condescension. Instead, he found a man of deep learning and quiet authority, living in a home that was more comfortable and more thoughtfully constructed than most houses Whitfield had visited in Manhattan. He found shelves of scientific journals, a library of over 300 volumes, a laboratory where Clara analyzed mineral samples and whiskey chemistry with instruments that would not have been out of place at a university. He found children who spoke knowledgeably about geology and botany and the physics of heat transfer. He found whiskey that made him close his eyes and sit in silence for a full minute after the first sip. His article, published in the spring of 1888, was notable less for its description of the whiskey operation than for its portrait of Eli himself. A man, Whitfield wrote, who had achieved something that most men spend their lives seeking without ever naming it. A perfect alignment between his nature and his circumstances, between what he was and where he lived and how he spent his days. The article concluded with an observation that Eli himself would never have made. That the people of Bowling Green had stopped using the phrase, "a Sutner inheritance," years ago, and that several of the families who had once mocked the cave dweller now sent their children to study under Clara in the hillside schoolroom. Clara kept the household running with the same precision her father brought to his watches. She was 60 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her hands still steady, her mind still sharp. She and Eli had been married for 33 years, and they still talked about chemistry and poetry and the behavior of light on limestone the way they had in the Louisville bookshop where they met. In the spring of 1891, Eli began to slow down. He was 71. His hands, which had shaped so much stone and oak, ached with arthritis. His eyes, which had mapped every crack and crystal in the cave, were dimming. He spent more time sitting at the desk by the entrance, looking out at the hills, writing in what would be the last of his many journals. He did not fear death. He had spent 40 years inside the earth, surrounded by stone that was 300 million years old. Human life, measured against limestone, was a flicker. What mattered was not the length of the flame, but what it illuminated. On August 9th, 1891, a warm summer evening when the katydids were singing in the cedars and the last light was turning the bluff face gold, Eli called his children and grandchildren into the main chamber of the cave. There were 11 grandchildren by then. James's 4, Helen's 3, Thomas's 4, and they crowded into the chamber with the easy familiarity of children who had grown up knowing that the best playground in Warren County was underground. Eli sat in his chair beside the hearth. Clara sat beside him, holding his hand. The children and grandchildren arranged themselves on the stone ledges and the floor, and for a moment the cave was full of the sound of breathing and shifting, and the small, restless movements of young bodies. "I want to tell you something," Eli said. His voice was quiet but clear, and it carried in the chamber the way it always had. The stone held sound the same way it held warmth. The children grew still. "When I came here," he said, "I had nothing. Your grandmother," he looked at Clara, "will tell you I had $17 and a handcart. But I had less than that. I had no plan. I had no one waiting for me. I had a cave that other people thought was worthless." He paused. The lantern flickered, but the cave wasn't worthless. It was just unexplored. And I think most things that look worthless are just unexplored. Most people who are called failures have just stopped looking. The world is full of passages that nobody has bothered to crawl through, and at the end of those passages, there are things that nobody has imagined. He looked at each of his grandchildren in turn, his eyes moving from face to face in the warm light. Don't ever stop looking deeper. Even when people laugh, especially when people laugh, because if everyone has already looked at something and decided it's nothing, and you look again and find something, then it was meant for you. It was waiting for you. He smiled. "There are still passages in this cave that I never explored. I'm leaving them for you." Eli Sutner died in his sleep 3 weeks later, on September 2nd, 1891, in the bed he had built 40 years earlier, in the room that Clara had designed, in the cave that his father had used for storing smoked meat. Clara was beside him. The temperature in the chamber was 55 degrees. Outside, the first hints of autumn were touching the Virginia creeper on the bluff face, turning it from green to red, the beauty revealed as the green faded, just as Clara had once described it on a bridge in Louisville long ago. Clara survived him by 11 years. She continued her botanical studies, completing a comprehensive catalog of the cave's microclimate flora that filled 3 volumes. She maintained the barrel logs until her eyesight failed in 1899, at which point Helen took over the records with the same meticulous care. Clara died in the cave on March 15, 1902, at the age of 73, with Helen's hand in hers and the sound of water dripping in the back chamber, the same sound that had greeted Eli on the first night he spent underground, half a century before. The Sutner Cave bourbon operation continued for another 18 years under the management of James and Thomas. Prohibition shut it down in 1920, and the aging chambers were sealed. Thomas's son, William, reopened them in 1934 after repeal and found that the barrels left behind, including several of Eli's original 1853 vintage, now over 80 years old, contained whiskey that was virtually priceless. A single barrel sold at auction in 1936 for what was then the highest price ever paid for American whiskey. The cave system itself was designated a Kentucky Natural Landmark in 1962. Clara's botanical illustrations of the cave flora are held in the permanent collection of the Smithsonian. Helen's book, Life at the Threshold, remains in print. The tramway rails that Eli followed to his discovery are still visible in the stone, worn smooth by decades of barrel transport, a path cut by one man's hands and followed by another man's curiosity. Modern distillers have studied the Sutner Cave aging method extensively, and their findings have confirmed what Eli and Clara documented a century and a half ago. Constant temperature, stable humidity, and the unique microclimate of a limestone cave produce chemical interactions between spirit and wood that simply cannot be replicated in above-ground warehouses. The Angel's share, that portion of whiskey lost to evaporation during surface aging, typically 2 to 4% per year, was measured in the Sutner cave at less than 0.5% annually, meaning that barrels retained nearly all of their contents over decades of maturation. Several contemporary bourbon producers now use cave aging or underground storage, and the scientific literature on the subject cites Eli Sutner's journals, all 23 volumes of them, as foundational texts. But perhaps the most remarkable artifact from the cave is not a barrel or a journal or a tramway. It is a small inscription carved into the limestone wall of the aging chamber, just below the one left by James Morgan Stokes. It reads, in Eli's neat, careful hand, "There is always more to find." It is still there. The stone holds it the way it holds warmth, patiently, permanently, waiting for whoever comes next to read it and believe it and pick up a lantern and go deeper.